Hi, Sip&Talkers. Welcome back to Sip&Talk.
You know, there's something really universal about graduation speeches.
Oh, definitely.
You've probably heard one, right? Maybe even, I don't know, given one.
Oh,
or definitely sat through a few.
Absolutely. That big moment.
Yeah, that moment where someone steps up, gives some, parting wisdom, sends the grads off into the world. It feels like a big deal.
They really are powerful platforms, aren't they? Moments for reflection, inspiration, setting a vision.
Right.
And the speaker often carries this weight of expectation to be insightful, relevant, maybe even, memorable.
Totally. But what if you looked at those speeches, or really any kind of big public expression, not just for the actual words or the advice, but for what they kind of accidentally tell you about the place, the society, the culture the speaker's coming from.
Now that's where it gets really interesting, because public communication, it's not made in a vacuum, is it?
No way.
It's so deeply shaped by the environment, the political system, social norms, what's okay to say, what's maybe not.
Exactly. So today, we're doing a bit of a deep dive into this really fascinating contrast that popped up in the material you shared. We're looking at how two people, both with really significant ties to Taiwan and China, expressed themselves publicly.
And how their experiences, their words, and especially the reactions to their words.
Yeah, the reactions. How that might light up some pretty fundamental differences in how people think, communicate, what they value in these two, distinct societies.
And we'll be focusing on two main figures. First, the filmmaker John M. Chu.
Oh yeah, Crazy Rich Asians.
Exactly, Taiwanese-American background. And second, Yurong Zhang, a student from mainland China who gave this pretty significant speech at Harvard.
Got it. And our mission here, what are we trying to do?
Well, the idea is to really unpack how the language they used, right? The themes they picked and those different reactions they got, how all that shines a light on these, ideological and cultural divides. And we're going to use this really interesting framework that critics mention, contrasting what's called a sha, zhen.com, is roughly false, grand, and empty.
False, grand, empty.
Okay. With nehu shorinhua, which basically means speaking human language.
Speaking human language, I like that.
Yeah, it's a lens some critics use to highlight these, let's say, perceived differences in communication styles across the strait. It's not just about word choice.
Right. It hints at something deeper.
Yeah.
About the system itself.
Exactly. It's about what that language signifies.
Okay, so let's start with the speakers. Get to know them and their platforms a bit. First up, John M. Chu, big Hollywood director.
That's right, successful filmmaker.
Yeah.
And his background, it's quite interesting for this comparison. He was raised in the U.S., but has these deep family roots in both places. His mother's from Taiwan and his father's from Sichuan in mainland China.
Oh, interesting mix. And he's connected to USC, right? The film school. Wasn't he supposed to give a speech there?
Yeah, he's an alumnus. He was actually slated to give the commencement speech in 2024, although that specific event ended up being canceled for other reasons.
Right.
But his work, generally focuses on personal stories, cultural fusion, exploring identity. Think Crazy Rich Asians, bringing that specific cultural experience to a massive global audience. And he's talked in interviews about, how making films, even just as a kid with a camera, allowed his parents to see themselves fitting into America, belonging here. That was his phrase.
Wow, that's a really personal, kind of relatable motivation, isn't it? Using his art, his platform, to capture that whole immigrant experience, that sense of belonging for his own family.
Absolutely. So his public expression feels very rooted in that personal narrative and cultural identity.
Okay. And that focus on the personal, that sounds like it connects to the framework we'll talk about later.
It does. It's a key thread. Keep that in mind.
Got it. Okay. So big contrast then. Let's talk about Yurong Zhang.
Right. Yurong Zhang, she's a student originally from Qingdao in China.
Right. Okay.
And she's part of the 2025 class at the Harvard Kennedy School, getting her master's in public administration.
Harvard Kennedy School.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a pretty significant global stage to be speaking from. And she did give a speech there.
She did, yes. Her speech was titled, Safeguard Our Humanity.
Safeguard Our Humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, what was the main gist?
The central message was really focused on, universal themes, things like diversity, internationalism, empathy, the need for unity and compassion in a world that feels, pretty divided right now.
I mean, okay, those sound like pretty standard positive graduation speech themes, yeah. Call for unity, be empathetic.
Yeah.
Seems hard to argue with that.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But the reception It was dramatically different depending on where people were reacting from.
And this is where it gets really telling, right? Let's dig into that, the different reactions.
Okay. So on the Harvard stage, and generally in international media, Gongjiang's speech was, largely well received. In the U.S. context, that emphasis on humanism, inclusivity, global connection, it resonated. People praised it.
All right, so positive feedback in the West, in academia, media circles. But you said it was different back in China. What happened there?
That's the really significant contrast. Within China, apparently, her speech kicked off this considerable firestorm of controversy online among some netizens.
Really? A controversy over that message? Was it about the content itself? Safeguarding humanity?
Surprisingly, not really about the content directly. It was much more about the speaker.
About her?
Yes.
Right.
The controversy seemed to revolve heavily around her personal background. Some people started questioning if she was a Sabosizir Kwangizignen, which basically means like a child of the powerful elite.
Ooh, wow.
And they alleged she'd gotten into Harvard through backdoor connections, not purely on merit.
Hold on. So a speech about universal humanity immediately turns into a debate about her family, her privilege, her connections. That seems intense.
Exactly. The focus just completely shifted away from the message onto the messenger's perceived status and sort of how she got there. It got so intense, she actually had to issue a public clarification online.
She had to defend herself.
Yeah. Addressing these points, she mentioned being mainly raised by her mother. She named specific recommenders for Harvard from places like Duke University, Credit Suisse.
Wow.
And she specifically denied getting recommendations from her father's government-linked organization.
Just incredible. Having to publicly detail and defend your whole educational paths just because you gave a speech. What does the analysis you looked at say about why? Why that kind of reaction in China?
Well, the interpretation is that this intense focus on her background, potential connections, the fairness of how resources are allocated, it reflects a core emphasis in China on collectivism.
Okay.
And a really high sensitivity to political correctness, plus these deep-seated concerns about social inequality and privilege. It becomes less about the individual expressing a view and more about how that individual fits into the system or maybe is perceived as benefiting unfairly from it.
So the reaction isn't really, do we agree with her message? It's more like, wait, how did she, given who she might be, get this platform? Is that fair?
Precisely. Now let's contrast that with John M. Chu's public reception. Again, we're looking mostly at his work and interviews, since that specific commencement speech didn't happen.
Right. And based on his career, his interviews?
Yeah.
His public stuff seems to operate in a different kind of space.
It really does. His work, like we said, Crazy Rich Asians, it brings Asian culture into mainstream Hollywood. His interviews often touch on his dual identity, being Asian American. And the reception to that kind of expression is generally way less politically charged. It's more focused on the cultural side, the artistic merit.
Yeah, people talked about representation in the movie, right? Or his directing style. Not so much about like his family's political connections back in Taiwan or China.
Exactly. And the analysis suggests this different reception reflects maybe Taiwan society's relative openness to personal expression, cultural exploration, even when it touches on complex identity stuff.
Okay.
His interviews often feel quite personal, pretty genuine about his feelings, how his identity shaped his work.
Okay, so, wow. One person gives a speech on a global stage, and back home, it triggers this intense scrutiny about their background, system fairness. The other person expresses themselves through art, talks about identity, and it's mostly discussed through a cultural or artistic lens. That's a really striking difference.
It is. And this leads us perfectly into that critical framework we mentioned earlier, Setia versus E.
Right, the false, grand, empty versus speaking human language. Okay, let's break this down. How does this framework help make sense of these different communication approaches?
Well, the analysis explains these terms are used by critics to highlight what they see as a fundamental difference in communication styles, often observed between China and Taiwan or, other democratic societies.
Got it. So let's start with false, grand, empty. What exactly does that style involve, according to this analysis?
So Jingda-Kink, literally false, grand, empty. The analysis describes it as language that's basically empty of real substance. It can sound impractical, maybe boastful, and it feels detached from genuine personal feeling or, lived reality.
So big, important sounding words, but they don't really connect to anything concrete or heartfelt, like official jargon.
Pretty much. Think of abstract slogans, official pronouncements, language that feels really generic, boilerplate. The analysis notes you often see this style in official speeches, propaganda, political rhetoric in the Chinese context.
Any examples?
Yeah, it gives one quote about striving for the Chinese dream of great rejuvenation. Grand idea, right? But critics might say it lacks relatable, specific human meaning.
Okay, I can see that. Big picture, but maybe impersonal. Now, how do critics connect this idea of Zhangden to Yuan Zhang's speech? Even though her themes, sounded positive.
That's the interesting part. The analysis suggests that some critics viewed her speech, despite those positive universal themes like safeguarding humanity, as having elements of pu.
Oh, what made it feel that way to them?
They felt it was quite abstract. It lacked concrete personal stories or specific or relatable examples to really ground those big universal themes.
Ah, okay. So the ideas were there, but not connected to personal experience.
Right. And some also felt it kind of echoed official Chinese narratives. For instance, the community of shared future for mankind, which is a concept the Chinese government promotes.
So the language itself, even using positive words, felt maybe distant, ungrounded, because it didn't seem tied to a specific human reality.
That seems to be the core of the critique, yeah. The grand themes delivered without that personal grounding were perceived by some critics as feeling, well, empty. And then the controversy about her background just amplified this. It led some to see her speech not as genuine expression, but as something called biyoyet, xi ringsling, which translates roughly to performative humanity.
Performative humanity. Ouch.
Yeah, basically like performing the role of a humanistic speaker, maybe without deep personal sincerity, perhaps because of the system she comes from.
Wow. That's a really powerful and pretty cutting critique. Okay, let's flip to the other side then. You're Shushuren, speaking human language. What does that look like?
So Shush is basically the opposite. It's described as a language that is direct, clear, sincere, relatable, and it focuses on genuine human emotion and actual lived experience.
Like actually talking like a normal person would talk.
Yeah.
In a real conversation.
Fundamentally, yeah. It's about authenticity, using plain language, connecting on an emotional level and experiential level. The material gives an example, like a speaker honestly talking to students about their own confusion after graduation.
Right, being vulnerable, being real.
That's Shush, yes.
Okay, so how is John M. Chu's expression, his films, his interviews, seen through this Su lens?
The analysis points directly to his approach. His focus on telling personal stories, exploring his cultural identity, showing relatable experiences in his movies, and in his interviews. That's seen by critics as embodying Neri.
Like how he talks about his family or his own feelings about identity.
Yeah.
That feels very direct, very personal. You get a sense of the actual person.
Exactly. In interviews, he discusses his complex identity in a really genuine way, often with humor, too. The material even mentions that in the draft for that commencement speech he was planning.
Yeah.
He included personal anecdotes about his time at USC, his family's restaurant history, confronting his own cultural identity crisis through Crazy Rich Asians, and even joking about his dad bod and sneaking into the Oscars once.
Joking about a dad bod and sneaking into the Oscars. At a commencement speech. Yeah, okay, that definitely screams speaking human language compared to, abstract political slogans.
Right. It grounds the message in his unique, imperfect, relatable human experience. His sincerity, his vulnerability, the specific stories, these are seen as the hallmarks of a day.
Okay, so this framework, it's not just saying one style is inherently better than the other, right? It's suggesting they're symptoms of something deeper. About the societies themselves.
Absolutely. That's the core insight here. The analysis makes it explicit. This difference isn't just about style preferences. It reflects deeper societal values and the political systems that shape public communication.
So how does S, speaking human language, connect to a society system?
It's linked in this analysis to democratic societies, like Taiwan, for example, places where there's generally more emphasis on individual freedom, encouraging critical thinking, and allowing for genuine personal expression without, fear of serious backlash.
Right.
The analysis actually includes a powerful quote. Eso is courage, a product of freedom.
Courage and freedom. Okay. And Eso, the false, grand, empty style, what does that signify about a society system?
That style is linked to more authoritarian systems, like China in this comparison. The analysis interprets Asha as emerging from systems that prioritize collectivism, enforce strict political correctness, demand obedience, and heavily promote state-approved narratives.
So when you have to speak within those lines.
Exactly. When public expression has to stick to those constraints, it often becomes cautious, formulaic, detached from personal truth. And the analysis puts it very starkly. Hasha is a product of fear and obedience.
Wow. Courage and freedom versus fear and obedience. That puts a really sharp point on it, doesn't it? It suggests the forces shaping public language are fundamentally different in these two contexts.
It does.
It's not just about sounding authentic. It's about whether the environment even allows for authenticity in public.
That's the profound implication that's drawn out. Public language can become less about conveying your actual personal truth and more about navigating what's acceptable, what forms and narratives are okay according to the system.
This framework, just applied to these two examples, really opens up a window into much bigger issues, doesn't it? What are some of the broader implications they highlighted?
Yeah, several key things come up. First, it really shows how fundamentally different political systems can shape the very nature of language itself.
How so?
Well, it can potentially make it harder in environments that favor oxy to even tell what's true from what's false, or to express genuine personal feelings publicly.
Because if everyone's sort of speaking in this abstract, careful way, how do you know what's real, what someone actually thinks or feels?
Exactly. It can kind of erode trust and the ability to connect authentically. Second, the analysis raises this challenge China might face, trying to gain international acceptance, or what they call discourse power, on the global stage.
Yeah.
If its main way of communicating publicly is perceived by outsiders as oxy, well, that's a problem.
Right. If your communication feels like empty slogans or propaganda, it's much harder to build genuine connections or trust internationally. That makes total sense.
Precisely. And third, the analysis points to this potential for, an increasing divergence between younger generations from these different systems.
In what way?
Taiwanese youth, maybe growing up with more freedom for personal expression, for win, might really prioritize sincerity and authenticity, whereas Chinese youth, constantly exposed to it in public life, might get more accustomed to it or even internalize that style as just the normal way to talk in public.
And that difference in how they approach public language, what they value in communication, that could make mutual understanding across the Taiwan Strait even harder down the line.
It's a real possibility raised by this analysis. So yeah, looking at the paths and the public words of John M. Chu and Yurong Jiang and using this critical lens of ek versus it offers a really compelling perspective.
Yeah.
It helps us see how these profound differences in political systems and cultural values actually show up in something as basic as how people are expected to talk and express themselves in public in Taiwan and China.
It really hammers home how much context matters, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just the message. It's the medium, the messenger, and the whole environment that shaped them.
It's a powerful illustration, really, of how freedom, or the lack of it, can literally shape the words people use in public life.
And that leaves you, the listener, with something interesting to think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this world just absolutely flooded with information, all these competing narratives flying around, what can the style, the authenticity, maybe the sincerity or lack thereof in someone's message actually tell us about the system, the environment that shaped them?
And maybe if the very language someone uses is a product of that environment, whether it's one of freedom or one of constraint, how does that impact our ability, to truly connect with them, to understand or even trust each other across these really significant cultural and political divides?
That's the big question, isn't it? It makes you want to listen a bit differently.
Right.
Beyond just the words, to the texture, the context, the felt sense of the message. Is it truly speaking human language, or is it something else entirely?
All right, well, that was a seriously deep dive. If you found all this as fascinating as we did, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future explorations here on Sip and Talk.
And hey, don't forget to check out our buddy Micky's YouTube channel. He's got some great stuff going on over there, always worth a look. See you next time.